This is your rectus femoris. The origin of the rectus femoris is at the anterior inferior iliac spine, and the insertion is at the tibial tuberosity of the tibia. The action of the rectus femoris is that it flexes the hip and it extends the knee. This red tape is your vastus intermedius. The origin is at the upper 2/3 of the anterior and lateral femoral shaft, and the insertion is at the lateral border of the patella and the quadriceps tendon. The action is it extends the knee. This is your vastus lateralis, and then this is your vastus medialis. Both muscles originate at the linea aspera on the posterior femoral shaft. The insertion is at the patella and tibial tuberosity by the patellar tendon. The action is knee extension. When the knee is flexed, both muscles play a role in slightly rotating the tibia. When the knee is extended, both muscles stabilize the knee against lateral displacement. This is your sartorius muscle. The origin is at the anterior superior iliac spine. The insertion is at the superomedial shaft of the tibia. The action of the sartorius muscle is that it crosses both the hip and knee joint and acts on both. This muscle is involved in flexion, lateral rotation, and abduction of the hip. It also assists in knee flexion. During gait, the sartorius is typically active only during the swing phase. This is your semimembranosus muscle. The origin is at the ischial tuberosity. The insertion is at the posteromedial tibial condyle. And the action for the semimembranosus muscle is the medial rotation, knee flexion, and hip extension. This is your semitendinosus muscle. The origin of the semitendinosus muscle is at the ischial tuberosity. The insertion is at a very long, thin tendon along the superior medial aspect of the tibia, and the action for the semitendinosus muscle is knee flexion, internal rotation, and hip extension. This is your biceps femoris. The long head of the biceps femoris is at the ischial tuberosity. The origin of the short head of the biceps femoris is at the shaft of the femur along the linea aspera. The insertion for both the short head and long head of the biceps femoris is at the fibular head. The action for the biceps femoris is external rotation, knee flexion, and hip extension. This is your adductor longus. The adductor brevis is below the adductor longus, and it can be palpated here. This is your pectineus. This is your gracilis. This is your adductor magnus. This is your tibialis anterior muscle. It originates at the upper 2/3 of the lateral tibia. This is the lateral condyle and the superolateral shaft of the tibia. The insertion is at the medial cuneiform of the first metatarsal. The action for the tibialis anterior is the dorsiflexion of the foot and supination of the foot. So this muscle is the extensor hallucis longus. The origin is at the central medial fibula, and the insertion is at the distal phalanx 1, and the action is the dorsiflexion of the big toe and the foot, and the supination of the foot. So this is your extensor digitorum longus. The origin is at the lateral tibial condyle, the anterior fibular shaft, and the interosseous membrane. The insertion splits into 4 parts. It inserts into the toes of toes 2 to 5, and at the middle and distal phalanx. The action for the extensor digitorum longus is the dorsiflexion of toes 2 to 5. So this is your peroneus tertius. The origin is at the anterior inferior fibula, and the insertion is at the 5th metatarsal, and it assists in the dorsiflexion and the eversion of the foot. This purple tape is your peroneus longus. The origin is at the head of the superior lateral fibula. The insertion is at the middle cuneiform and at the base of the 1st metatarsal. The action of the peroneus longus is the plantar flexion of the ankle and pronation. This blue tape is the peroneus brevis. The origin is at the inferior lateral fibular shaft, where it is covered by the peroneus longus, and the insertion is at the lateral tubercle of the 5th metatarsal. And the action of the peroneus brevis is also the pronation and plantar flexion of the ankle. This is your flexor digitorum longus. The origin is at the posterior medial shaft of the tibia, and the insertion is at the distal phalanges 2 to 5. The action for the flexor digitorum longus is the plantar flexion of toes 2 to 5, assist in the plantar flexion of the ankles, assist in the inversion of the foot, and supports the arches of the foot. This is the tibialis posterior. The origin of the tibialis posterior is at the posterior superior tibia and fibular shaft and the interosseous membrane. The insertion is at the navicular cuboid, lateral cuneiform, and metatarsals 2 to 4. The action for the tibialis posterior is plantar flexion, inversion, and supports the arches of the foot. This red tape is the flexor hallucis longus. The origin is at the posterior inferior fibula and the interosseous membrane. The insertion is at distal phalanx 1, and the action for the flexor hallucis longus is the plantar flexion of the big toe and the ankle. This is your soleus muscle. The origin is at the posterior-superior tibia and fibula. The insertion is at the posterior aspect of the calcaneus. The action of the soleus is plantar flexion. This is the gastrocnemius. The origin is at the bottom of the femur. The insertion is at the posterior aspect of the calcaneus, and the action is also plantar flexion. This is plantar flexion. The muscles involved in plantar flexion is the soleus, gastrocnemius, flexor hallucis longus, tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, peroneus brevis, and peroneus longus. This is dorsiflexion. The muscles involved in dorsiflexion is the extensor digitorum longus, peroneus tertius, extensor hallucis longus, and tibialis anterior. And tibialis anterior. This is the inversion of the foot. Eversion of the foot. This is the abduction of the foot. This adduction of the foot. The muscles involved in the supination of the foot is the tibialis anterior and the extensor hallucis longus. This is the pronation of the foot. The muscles involved is the peroneus brevis and the peroneus longus. This is the medial arch. The muscles involved in the medial arch is the abductor hallucis, tibialis posterior, peroneus longus, and flexor hallucis longus. This is your lateral arch. The muscles involved in the lateral arch is peroneus brevis and peroneus longus. Transverse arch. The muscles involved in the transverse arch, adductor hallucis, peroneus longus, tibialis posterior, and the interosseous muscles.